Hey, welcome back to the Tranquili-Tease. I'm your host, Marina Mars, and today I'd like to give you a stripped down and raw look into the life of an entertainer. So I mean both pre-COVID, before all of these things happened and all the restrictions came down upon us, as well as kind of what's happening now. I'd also like to give you some insight into other aspects of the entertainment industry that I may have encountered but maybe not necessarily have stuck around for. So basically, I want to give you a behind-the-scenes look into the shadows of showbiz, both the light and the dark. So before we dive in though, please be sure to click the subscribe button followed by the little bell for notifications if you're hanging out on YouTube, or go ahead and click follow if you're tuning in from any other podcast streaming site or IGTV. That way I can ensure you get the content you need when you need it. So let's go right on in. So when we think of the entertainment industry as a whole, right, we see flashing lights, we see shiny costumes and lipstick stained napkins and glamour, right? But what about all of the other stuff that the audience doesn't see that goes into making a production or an event or a show a reality? Well, my friends, enter the shadows of showbiz, right? So we've got kind of two different aspects of this I want to talk about today. On one hand, what happens backstage and behind the scenes, right? So what does it take in terms of workload for the performers and the producers and everyone in between and beyond, right? I want to refer to these as the positive aspect of the shadows of show business. And what I mean by this is that the information is not harmful. Now, of course, like not knowing how to grow your social media as a performer might be a little bit debilitating in your career in some ways or another. Wouldn't necessarily call that a harmful, intense struggle that inspires trauma, right? This is not a traumatic struggle, therefore it is a positive, it is a learning curve, it's something that you pick up as time goes, right? But then, on the other hand, of the shadow of showbiz, there are some toxic things lurking. Due to the fact that the entertainment industry basically is very difficult to navigate. And I don't think that this is any coincidence. So basically, whenever you're trying to navigate through any aspect of it, it feels like a lot of smoke and mirrors. And sometimes behind that is just like a really well-meaning production. They just don't have a lot of money or resources, and it's a lot harder to get out to you. On the other hand, because of that vulnerability and that artistic, intuitive trust, if you will, there are going to be some leeches that take advantage of that. And we're going to kind of dive into that aspect of showbiz as well towards the end of the episode. So basically, my goal is to show you a little bit of each side to just get the conversation going. If I was to do I could do an in-depth episode on like every single bullet point that I'm going to talk about, really, right? But I just kind of want to lay out a groundwork and the foundation so that we can continue the conversation from here and move forward. I've fallen into a lot of these shadows myself. There's a lot of them that I think everybody should struggle through, kind of paying your dues. But there are other parts that you could totally stumble less and be totally fine, and there's no reason for you to suffer. And as someone who is, got their foot in the industry, has been in the industry for about 5 years now, I don't want to see a novice have to go through some of the same bullshit that I had to. And again, but there's some bullshit that you do have to go through. So at the end of the day, though, I feel that it is best to leave an industry or an establishment or a situation or an environment better than when you arrived. So that is my goal today with this episode, specifically kind of talking from the burlesque aspect. But do know that my background also is in showgirling and pole dancing, general circus stuff, fetish stuff, so many different types of events that it's kind of hard for me to talk about. Try to keep it into one bubble, but I'm going to do my best to talk about it from the aspect of burlesque, and that'll become more clear as to why as we move forward through the video. Alright, so burlesque business shadows. So here are some things that you may not realize that professional entertainers have to do if this is their full-time situation and this isn't just a hobby, right? Alright, so number one, right, first thing, building a website. I've had marinamars.com now for at least 5 years. It mostly just acted as like my performance career resume, a gallery for any modeling gigs that might come up, you know, links to videos for entertainment purposes, or getting booked for other situations. Then I've got all of the event producing I've done, all the education, all of the certifications so that I can teach people and like talk and have the trust of the community, right? So it basically just acted as this one-stop shop of here's just like my umbrella of all the things that I do. This, at that point in time, all the way up until about, honestly, this year, honestly 2020. So really the past 4 years of my website being alive, it was just that. I wasn't monetizing at all off of it. And I'd pay, let's see, about $200 a year for Wix.com's like whole bundle and keeping my domain alive. And then obviously then that doesn't even account for the random little things that I'll pay for or learn about, like one-off seminars or like full-on coaching experiences or business courses that I take that help my website become better and what it is today. So I don't even know what that number is. God, at least a couple thousand. But I didn't even start technically monetizing off of it until this year. So that's an expense that no one tells you about, and that it's not something that you necessarily need, but as I'll get into when we get into like booking a tour, if you want to be taken seriously, you kind of need a website. So that's an expense no one ever tells you about. But now that I am diversifying my revenue streams and I have online coaching services and I have the Martian Movers 30-day challenge, as well as a new merch shop for physical items, now my website is monetizing on a totally different level, but with that comes more costs because then you need to buy different business tools in order to keep up with everything that we're going through, including planners just for getting your workflows going and your systems created. Category number 1, building a website. None of that sounds like being an artist, right? Guess what? It totally 100% is. It's a shadow that no one tells you about. But honestly, just getting a landing page going, like, is bare minimum, and I'm going to call that startup fee is going to be about $100 right there. All right, so then we move into the second category, which would be content creation. So obviously, as artists, we create content. Like that's, I would say the 2020 lingo of being a commissioned artist, just like, back like hundreds of years ago, if you were an artist and it was your career, rich people would pay you they would commission you to create these grand pieces that you would live with them. You would they would feed you, like all of these things, right? Now, like, they're technically content creators, even though it's not, on Instagram, and they don't have an LLC. It's the same kind of situation. So that being said, what kind of tools do you need to create that content that goes beyond just the artistic process of it, right? So for example, as a burlesque dancer, technically my brush strokes, if you will, are with my body and my movement, as well as the costumes I put together. That's a whole nother fucking expense that's not even part of this episode. Barf, I don't even want to look at that spreadsheet. But what do I need in order to showcase that art though? Visual equipment, audio equipment, programs for processing all of the data that comes from that other equipment that I bought. So now we're looking at thousands of dollars. If I had to add that category up, of course nowadays we have our cell phones, so that's cool when it comes to recording some things, but that only goes so far. And then if you just want a bare minimum mic like this just to start up your own generic podcast, this one runs for $50, and then the other one I have when I feel like doing a full ass setup, that mic's about $120. And then we've got whenever I'm using an actual camera, that one was like $2,000. And then anytime you see a stabilizing shot, anytime you see me someone's shooting a video of me, always my partner Ozzy, and you notice that the frame is really steady rather than like shaky as shit, it's because there's a device called a gimbal. That gimbal costs $500. Okay, so that's just basic content creation. And again, that's not even counting, I took a $400 business course on YouTube specifically in order to understand like keywords and how to create the best content, get it out, get it edited, how to, you know, hire certain people to deal with certain issues when they do arise, when eventually my content's around long enough. It is a rabbit hole here, you guys. I am just going to stop there and go right into aspect number 3. Another shadow of the burlesque business that you don't fucking realize. Building social media. So here we've got, I personally only like to use Instagram and YouTube, so for everything else we're not even going to talk about because I don't give a shit about it, and I'm also not an expert, so it doesn't make sense for me to talk about it. Building social media, Instagram. Okay, so I've spent $500 on this coaching situation where basically figuring out how to Instagram host in order to have a business on there without breaking any laws or regulations. You guys do not realize it's just not as simple as like, hey, I'm going to put my PayPal link up and hope that works out. Like, because the moment you actually start making real dough, like the amount that the IRS is going to like want to audit you about, you can't be just doing that. Like, you can't be making like content the same way that you used to. You have to adhere by certain laws and regulations, otherwise you can get sued, and it's a bureaucratic shit show for that. So $500 there doesn't even begin to include any of the ads that I have to buy, because again, as a burlesque dancer, as a woman, my body is always censored on the internet. So if I want any of my things to be seen, if I want any sort of reach like any other person who's clothed all the time, I have to pay for that. That is a privilege, by the way. That being said, we'll move forward. Into aspect number 4, because I already talked about YouTube a little bit there. Business shadow of burlesque number 4, building a tour. Okay, so if you are, again, not a hobbyist, you want to make enough money to be able to first off break even, but second, maybe even profit if you can, you can't just stay in your hometown. Again, at this point, I'm mostly about to talk pre-COVID because obviously the world's a little bit different at this moment. But in order to build a tour, in order to build your career, you need to go on tour. So in order to go on tour, you have to decide where you want to go. How do you decide where you want to go? It's going to do hours and hours and hours and hours of research and networking and getting to know people, getting to know producers, understanding how to Google these things in order to find other shows in the area so that you're not just traveling 400 miles for one show just to turn right back around. Like, you're gonna, like, your gas won't even be covered, right? You want to be able to figure out, okay, so I need to have enough shows to cover my gas money to get there and back. We need to make sure it's in a timely manner because, cool, I got 2-3 shows booked, but if they're over the course of a week, okay, well, who's paying for lodging? Okay, now, do I know someone there where I can get lodging covered? Or am I going to sleep in my car? Is that a possibility? Maybe there's a campsite around, but then how am I supposed to shower and deal with this? So that's not really a possibility. See how it rabbit holes? You've got, it sounds like a lot of chaos, right? So the things I mentioned were finding shows, putting a schedule together, then you have to, like, you know, contact these producers and get booked, which means, again, you have to figure out the logistics of an email, which is the next shadow I'll get into, and arrange your travel to cost as little as possible so that you can hope and pray to fucking titty Jesus that you break even and make money. So how do you kind of put all of that together? How do you make that chaotic monster not such a shadow demon, right? That's actually one of the coaching services that I do provide. So please feel free to send me a message if that's one of those things that you're super interested in. You're like, how the hell do I become a traveling showgirl and get all of these logistics figured out? I got you. I'll also do some upcoming episodes on stuff like that. But, you know, let's move forward in our list. So this email, so what do you need in this email in order to get booked? So on top of, just the basic information like your name, like what kind of acts that you typically bring to the table, your availability, what time you're going to be in town, all of those easy things, right? But you need to also remember that technically in this situation, you are the business and the producer is the client, not the other way around, right? So because of that, you need to ensure that you understand how to write copy, how to make a sales pitch. Technically, you are selling yourself in that way. So some people really like to, like me, spend a lot of money on education. So naturally, I've done a lot of copywriting courses, marketing. I went through a lot of that stuff with B School once again. Really, the sky is the limit here, but again, this is an expense that is not very obvious. And even if it doesn't cost you technically, in the sense that maybe you're not going to take a business course on it per se, you will likely find that if you continue this pursuit long term, you will be you will be spending a lot more time. It's just not as efficient. So even though it doesn't necessarily cost you those, George Washingtons, they are still costing you something which is, in my opinion, a lot more valuable, which is your time, in order to get good at these things and understand how to get booked. Additionally, this is where the website comes back into play, right? So I noticed that once I was like, oh, whoops, I forgot to have like an official email signature that has like my titles, where I'm based, and my website and my social media links. The minute I got my website looking good and I have that little email signature looking like real tight in there, that was when I got all the gigs. So for example, when I first started figuring out this formula of getting booked and figuring out this business shadow, I tried it out in San Francisco. And, I've been toying with it when I lived in the Midwest, but I really going to San Francisco was the first time. I had no friends I was staying with. I had no crutch. I literally knew nobody in that city, but I knew I always wanted to be there. I knew I had enough money in my savings, worst case scenario, to get me through the trip, even if it would financially destroy me. So I was like, I'll try. And I did it, and I ended up breaking even for that very first time, and every time since then I have definitely profited. So that all being said, again, the website being in the email, doing all the work for you, doing that sales funnel to just ensure your producer, damn, that girl really does have everything I need in a show. Boom. That's so much work. You know how many years it took me to figure that out? Shadow of showbiz. Moving on to the next one. I've lost count of how many I'm on now. 1, 2, 3, 4. We are on number 6. All right, building a hometown residency. This is another shadow that kind of isn't, it's probably the most intuitive of this list, but it's still difficult. So what I mean by this is, how do you, even if you're a traveler, eventually you're going to want to come home, and you're going to want to be able to have these gigs that you can rely on. And most specifically, you're going to want the kind of gigs that have that return on investment, so you don't have to continuously pitch. You can just get booked at the same gig month after month, which I had multiple of these in Vegas before COVID took them away. So how do you build one of those? Well, consistently showing up. Even if you weren't booked for the show, you still show up as a spectator, as a support, as a member of the community. You still network, you still throw your dollar bills at every person. In playing the networking game, you want to make sure that you are also supporting and watering your garden, right? So a lot of human expense comes into this, but and it blends into the lines of the personal business lines, because especially, again, as an artist, the line gets blurred, and very easily people become your friends because it's a much more tight-knit situation. Therefore, it's going to cost you more. Lastly, you want to be able to find the right fit for you, right? So this is another cost that people kind of don't talk to you about, because the shadow is, no one likes to hear that they don't belong somewhere. right? Like, no one wants to be like, okay, cool, like you were a beginner, you were born in this community, we love you, but you need to leave the nest because it turns out like now that you're fully developed, you don't really belong here. No one wants to tell you that, but sometimes that's the case. It was definitely the case for me. I got my start in Wisconsin, love Wisconsin forever. Great place, also a terrible place in some ways. But it was the glass ceiling for me. It was not where I wanted my hometown residencies to be while I was on the road, because the consistency just wasn't there. Partially because the community just wasn't developed to that point. But also, again, finding the right fit for you and your type of art specifically. It's a shadow that not enough people talk about, and I wish they would, because people think that it's about their talent or their amount of, acts or their quality. And no, sometimes it's just like your vibe just doesn't fit here. And that's okay. That's totally okay. Once you integrate that shadow into your being, it ends up becoming the biggest source of light, to the point where it ends up being your guide. Like the amount of rejection emails I receive still, well, I mean, COVID again, but pre-COVID, like it brought me more of what I truly wanted. It created more space for that. So again, it's only a shadow until you make it not a shadow. Moving into the 7th category of shadow of burlesque that people don't talk to you about is building your own show or events, right? So it's not just as simple as like, okay, well, I want to have a show. Let me just like send out a couple messages and then like we'll do this thing and it'll be fun, right? Like, no, these are still people's lives that you're dealing with. Now you're in this leadership position where you need to make sure you're making the right decisions for your community, for your staff, for your venue, for your audience. Like, there's a lot at stake here. And it also isn't even just about booking your favorite friends unless you're doing like a private event, right? In this situation, you need to be like, okay, well, as a producer in this community, that means I am representing us as a whole to people who are non-burlesque dancers and not necessarily a part of our community. They are just viewing our art. So you want to make sure that it is nice and balanced. You want to make sure you're not just booking a bunch of skinny white bitches, right? Like, you want to make sure you have this variety, which we will get into in the next section. Additionally, you want to make sure that you are following all of these laws, especially like, oh my God, I took it for granted, y'all. When I lived in Wisconsin and I was producing shows, it was so easy. It was cash. I had the best deal. I had the bar paying me money. I didn't even have to pay a single thing of rent. I didn't have to split any of my things. I didn't even have a door like charge at all, and I was still able to pay my performers really well for that specific pie slice and time. It was amazing. Then I moved here in Las Vegas. There are cabaret licenses. Those are separate from like your business license. Those are separate from alcohol licenses. And the minute you have a venue that has alcohol, it's different rules than if you have a venue that does have alcohol. There are certain places in town that have different nudity requirements and other things. Like, you could straight up be going to jail if like you just show a different amount of skin on one side of town than the other. Shadow of showbiz. Serious shadow. Then we talk about paying appropriately and charging appropriately. So making sure that you are paying your people and you are not taking advantage of anyone, but also you're not underselling or overselling. Finding that happy balance and that happy medium is a formula that takes so fucking long. No wonder a lot of people are just like, you know what? I'm just not cut out for this producing thing. It takes a lot of work. It's not something that you can just put together in a fucking weekend like a science project. It's a business. And that being said, it takes time, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. It just takes time. It just takes time to get it out of the shadow and integrate it into your full self and your full workload, right? So that all being said, that was so many shadows, right? Like, did you even know like that's the whole business side? I mean, that's not even the whole. I know that there are certain aspects of this that I haven't quite gotten to share because I'm trying to keep this episode as short as possible, but it's really hard because there's so much information here. But these are all things that people kind of get intimidated by, that kind of push them out of the industry without them realizing, no, these are things that you actually have power over, you have control over, you can learn more about it in order to get better at it. So if you integrate these aspects of the shadow into yourself and your career, then it becomes a lot easier. And like I mentioned, somewhere at the halfway point in between this, if you have any questions specifically about any of these aspects, I do provide coaching services for this, as well as many other little tidbits that we'll get to in the future. So if you have any questions, send me an email or leave me a comment. Now I want to get into the really, really ugly, awful, terrible part of the shadow of showbiz. And for this, again, this is just the beginning. This is just the conversation starter. I'm basically just putting out a list of things that I think are problematic as fuck, as well as what other people in the community have mentioned before. You know, some of my colleagues have been addressing, especially since the pandemic has started, because we don't have shows, all we get to do is talk to each other, talk about the problems. That's kind of what I'm laying out here. I think every single bullet point in this list deserves its own episode, and at some point I do have the goal of hitting all of these, especially in interview format when the time comes for that to be a little bit more manageable. So to begin, traumatic side of the shadow of showbiz, I have 6 points. The first one is cancel culture. So it's really sad when, you know, this isn't even necessarily just the entertainment industry, but I think it hurts us a lot more publicly, especially when we are literally already naked, like we're already at this level of vulnerability. And then, you know, the minute you say anything, sometimes there are people in spaces who allow you to have time to grow and learn and adjust. And then there are other times where people are just like, I have fucking had enough of this. I just literally can't take it from another single human being. You are fucking canceled. Your whole career is canceled. And if it is the right person with a big enough audience and a big enough, you know, digit on their social media, your whole fucking career could die for a moment or forever. And all it could take is one thing. I call this a shadow because while most of the time I think that what we view as cancel culture is actually like a long time struggle, we're just seeing the moment of the cancellation. We're not seeing the journey up to that cancellation. So sometimes like it might seem like there are events that are cancel culture, but in reality it's like, okay, no, that guy was a fucking rapist, or like, oh no, like that woman definitely like never fucking paid anyone and it's just so happens to be the first time you've heard of it, then yes, it's a little bit different. But what I'm talking about with cancel culture is I've seen people who have tried their best to do everything that they can to come back, to apologize, to do everything that they can, and sometimes that's just never good enough, which again, I call this a traumatic side because it's traumatic for everybody involved, the people who were hurt and the person who is hurt, the person who is canceled, who it's just one of those situations where, again, when you pair this with the fact that burlesque dancers are already literally naked, their naked bodies are on the internet, that's where it gets to be extremely traumatic, because then, you know, it gets a little bit deeper than just like Bob down the street who just like works at the local car dealership, you know, like it's a little bit, it's just different for us as entertainers. It's just different for us as artists. It's just different for us as naked people on the internet. That totally deserves its own episode. Moving on to number 2, abuse of power. There are a lot of people that abuse power, right? You've got people who will do that and sexually exploit people who are beneath them in terms of like the hierarchy of a show, or maybe they're a producer or a photographer or a booking agent, and the only way that you can get this gig get a one-up on everyone else as if you sleep with someone. I mean, there's a reason people still write songs about that. Like, no amount of becoming a fully realized human being will stop that out of human nature, I think. Like, it's pretty unfortunate, and it happens quite often. You also see people who abuse their power in the sense that they will just use their platform for hate. They will use their platform for, again, shutting people down that may or may not necessarily deserve it. It can go a lot of ways, and the last aspect of this that I think is worth mentioning is knowing that you have a large audience, knowing that one of the things you're saying or doing is problematic, and yet continuing to broadcast that to your audience is an abuse of power in my eyes, because we don't realize, we think we're just talking to a screen. Like, there's technically no one in this room with me, but I know that there are real life humans. I've seen the insights. Like, I know hundreds of people are tuning in from different locations altogether. So to pretend like there's not a responsibility involved in this is it's ridiculous to me. Moving on to point number 3, access, the ability to access something, right? So the privilege of accessing certain spaces, or the gatekeeping and elitism of allowing, oh, well, you're a real dancer, you're not, or, you know, X, Y, or Z. This whole category of access is a really, 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 really deeply disturbing shadow in my eyes. Not that the others weren't. What I mean by this, though, specifically, is there are a lot of people who, again, they'll push people out of the space just because they don't look like them. Especially with all of the conversations that we've been having as a society, as a culture in whole, is systemic racism, and furthermore, what I would like to add to this is systemic ableism. So all of these shows that aren't being as aware of the type of people that they're booking is causing harm. As I had mentioned earlier, if you're just producing a show that's just a bunch of skinny white bitches, what are you telling the world? That's the only thing that's sexy? That's the only thing that's worth watching? So then once we start thinking about, okay, well, how can we close the racial inequality gap here? Like, how can we, book more people of color, and not just as a token, but like truly, and not even as a minority, but really giving an equal access to all different types of people, including, again, I bring in the word ableism because a lot of spaces I've found haven't been making any sort of arrangements to allow handicapped people to be able to perform, whether it's like physically they can't get up on the stage because it's risen, or what is it called? The fog. I've had people who have visual and sensory general impairments that make a lot of fog and flashing lights really difficult while they're on stage. So I've been to venues who, like, they won't even allow them in the show because they're like, oh, well, the lighting has to stay the same throughout the whole show. They're tiny little things that we don't even think about, that it's like, okay, I get that we have shoestring budgets, but that doesn't give us an excuse to exclude people. So if you're working with a shoestring budget, maybe you should, I don't know, get more creative, or, maybe you shouldn't be producing until you've had these kinds of questions answered a little bit more and get a little bit more experienced. It's just so hard for me to understand how you're gonna just put all of your friends in a show, or just people you're used to, people that your audience is used to, and not try to diversify the identity of beauty. More on this on episode 2, What is Beauty? I go real hard on this subject. Moving into one of my last points here, another shadow of show business being the lack of respect for elders. and the lack of respect in terms of paying dues. So, lack of respect for elders. Number one, I don't mean that, like, obviously elders in any field are going to kind of suck in some ways, right? Like, in the sense that some views might be outdated, you know, some ways that they bring about acts may not be legal anymore. So, for example, I know a lot of older women who were magicians back in the day, and some of the things that they do with animals is not technically legal in some states anymore. That's just the way that culture has moved. I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of them, but that being said, that doesn't make them any less worthy of respect that we do owe in certain aspects. Basically, you don't get to just like come into an industry a couple months in and then talk a bunch of shit about people who've already been there, or you know, like try to not extend the joy and the welcoming and the love that you would give to any of your peers, someone that you grew up with or someone you just started burlesque with. Why can't you give that to people who are older? Why do you have to be jealous? Why do you have to be spiteful? These are some things that kind of are a big issue in the shadow, because how do you expect an industry and an art form to stay alive if you're not respecting and watering and growing the roots that have been there the longest? Every plant deserves a little bit of pruning, I'll give you that, but that doesn't mean you rip out the whole roots right away. I mean, just look at what happened with the Dust Bowl. And wrap this up, paying your fucking dues. Again, going in that same vein, I know some of the stuff, the entry-level stuff that you think you should be paid for, which eventually would be cool, right? For example, stage kittening. Stage kittening is one of those things that as a burlesque dancer, we all do when we start our careers, and if you don't, I'm sorry, honey, you have not paid your dues, and I'm going to respect you a little bit less if you've never stage-handed before. It's something you have to do. And if you haven't, you're just pushing this responsibility onto other people, which means you'll never have the empathy for understanding what it's like to be them. Therefore, when you go on and start producing shows or do anything else, you're just not going to have the same amount of respect as you should for them, because you never walked in their shoes. Obviously, it would be really cool if we get to the point in burlesque where we can pay everybody a lot all the time, but as it stands, stagehands usually are the last ones to get paid. And so when people try to not pay their dues, it causes a lot of issues, and this is a shadow that, you know, unfortunately some people learn a little bit too late, and they end up, boom, point number one, cancel culture just cancels them. And it's something that could have been easily fixed. Now, all of that being said, I don't think that this is unlike the entertainment industry as a whole, though. I think a lot of these issues stem everywhere, and the biggest upshot here is that while burlesque as a culture can be exhausting as hell to be a part of sometimes, I do appreciate the fact that burlesque dancers are self-aware mirrors of the cultures that they came from. So while they're completely inconsolable and constantly upset by everything, they kind of have a right to be, right? And they themselves are a work of art in that way. Myself and every single burlesque performer I've ever met, all included. This was a very long-winded episode. Thank you so much for paying attention. Next week, we are diving into what it means to be a hero and why that's even relevant. Please tell me about your experience, you know, with any of these shadow aspects of the burlesque industry, the entertainment industry. You name it. I want to hear all about it. Please head on down to the comments section on YouTube or IGTV. I want to hear all about it. And on a final note, if you haven't already signed up for my newsletter, the Martian Gazette, I highly recommend it because it is a free, sporadic dose of love, beauty, and pleasure. For more information, you can go ahead, just go on over and visit marinamars.com. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Until next time, my loves, XOXO.